Hi, this is Scott, Kilo Sierra 6, Delta Alpha Yankee. Today's video is related, and actually I should just give it an official part because what was a 5-part series on You Need Comm Gear now, I think we need to turn that into a 6-part series because I need to enhance with this particular episode a little bit more on radio operations. The last video I talked about radios. I talked about what you could and couldn't do with them. I talked about different tools in the toolbox, small radios, big antennas, small antennas. But what I failed to really drill down on and get any traction on was developing realistic expectations of HT performance. And that's what this is all about. HTs are generally going to be the first radio that someone buys. In a lot of cases, they then try to make this the only radio that they buy and use. And therein lies the problem is, well, these are indispensable as personal communication devices that go anywhere with you and are instantly available to give you limited communications. They're great for talking team member to team member or group member to group member. They have some limited applications when it comes to repeater operations, but they're mostly inter-team radios. They're mostly inter-group radios. And like I said, they can be used for repeaters, and in some cases used very successfully. But in some cases, that can be challenging, and there's more that needs to be done. And I am going to do some very specific videos on extending the range and operational characteristics of these radios. There are some things you can do, but at some point you hit diminishing returns where you really can't get much more performance out of the radio, and you're going to have to go to something bigger and better. Now, the reason I'm so compelled to do this video and fit this in is because over the past week and a half, it's really been pressed home with me over a number of interactions I've had completely unrelated to what I'm doing here. These are interactions with people trying to use our GMRS repeater for the club. This is some people that I've encountered on Facebook, on groups, and some of the things that I've seen. It's really put upon me the necessity to talk about this because I don't think it gets talked about enough. People talk about HTs like they're magical in some sense, and I have probably been guilty of that myself, in that all I talk about is HTs, so people must assume, well, that's the only kind of radio you need, and it is not. It is definitely not. You are going to need higher power radios. You are going to need bigger antennas, and we'll talk about that in the radio section. I talked about it in the last video, but what I want to kind of get you away from is thinking that all you need is an HT and you're ready to go. You just buy it, program it, turn it on, and everything should happen. And that's not the case. There is an art and science to doing this stuff. There are techniques and tactics that you're going to need to know how to do in order to make a contact with somebody or get a signal through. It's not, in some cases it is as easy as just turning the radio on and talking. If you're talking across a parking lot or the other side of a shopping mall, or from one campsite to another, fairly closely located together, that's fine. They'll be fairly trouble-free. It's when you're trying to make those distant contacts, when you're trying to hit repeaters, when you're trying to operate at extended distances with other radios on simplex, you need to know a thing or two about line-of-sight communications and how that's applied. So that's what today is all about. Bit of a long preamble, but my videos go long. I've had a few people beef that. I'm sorry, I cannot help you. My videos are the length they are because they're the length they are. So I caution you, this one's probably going to be a long one. So there. So let me talk about a couple of the circumstances that I've come up against in the past week or so, and talk about the lessons we can learn from those. And the first one is generally the most common one that you're going to encounter, and you may encounter this personally as a user, or you may encounter this in talking to someone else. Is they'll say, well, I got this radio and I can hear repeaters, but I can't get into the repeater. I can't get anybody to talk to me. I don't know what's going on. And they'll assure you that everything's programmed correctly. And in a lot of cases, that is true. Everything is programmed incorrectly, or is programmed correctly. But what's happening here oftentimes is that they're missing the point on how these radios communicate and how wattage and antenna height and things like that can change the equation for you. So as a reminder, there are two types of communications you're going to do with these radios. They're line of sight, they're FM, and you are going to, in the first case, which is simplex, you're going to try to get this radio to talk to this radio. Now, all things being equal, they both possess about the same kind of antenna, and they both put about the same amount of output wattage through the antenna. So if these radios are in range of each other, in other words, if this radio can hear this radio, chances are this radio can hear this radio in simplex. So if they were so far away that you couldn't hear them, chances are they couldn't hear you either. So you kind of work like that. You're trying to be in line of sight. You're trying to keep the view between this antenna and this antenna as unobstructed as possible. Now, for instance, if you were in an urban environment and you went on one side of a very large building and this is on the other side of a very large building, but in the parking lot at the same distance you could talk, you go to the other side you can't, it's because the signal's blocked. Very easy concept to understand. In a larger sense, when we start talking about very extended distances, that's where we start using things like repeaters to extend the useful range of our radios. Now, in the repeater case, this radio is now going to send a signal to a repeater that's located at a higher elevation. So the signal will go from this radio to the repeater. The repeater will duplex the signal and send it out at a higher wattage from a higher elevation, covering a larger area, a much larger area, often outside of the range of this radio. And that's where this problem comes in if I can't get into the repeater. You may be able to hear the repeater from 60 miles away because that repeater is very high. It might be at 7,575 feet, and it might be pumping out at 100 watts. That equals a lot of extra distance. This, however, has a short compromised antenna. It's at ground level, and it's only putting out 5 watts. So it's likely in this case what's happening is you are too far away from the repeater. Now, I'm going to tie in another story to this because these two stories tie together. The guy that can't make contact. And this is also a cautionary tale about getting your information from Facebook groups and just some dude you met. And this is probably the 100% reason I'm making this video, because I saw something that played out, and it was a very good example also of a little bit of knowledge being a dangerous thing. So I'm on this Facebook group, GMRS again, and you're going to see a trend. A lot of this is GMRS. And I think a lot of this problem comes from the fact that, for instance, with ham, before you can even play, you got to study, take a test, and actually learn some stuff before you even get into the hobby. So people do enter into the hobby with a little bit better knowledge base from the very beginning, because they have to learn, even if they memorize the questions, they're memorizing a question and they're memorizing an answer. And in that process, they at least have that equation in their head. So they're able to actually have a little bit of a step up in terms of being new to the hobby per se. But when it comes to GMRS, a lot of these guys, you just pay your money, get your ticket, buy your gear, and there's a lot of knowledge that's missing here. But this guy, okay, so what he was surmising, and this relates to all that we're talking about. So he starts his post out by saying this. He says, increased wattage does not increase distance. Increased antenna height equals increased distance. And I thought, okay, well, I guess you're half right. Yes, fundamentally, the best way to extend the range of your radio is to get your antenna up high. Again, line of sight communications. You're getting above the curvature of the earth, which is a thing, by the way, because one thing people will bring up is, well, at 5 watts, I can talk to the International Space Station. Why can't I get a signal to that, that other guy that's 60 miles away? Well, curvature of the earth, natural horizon. What happens is at some point, because we're on a ball, space station is just directly overhead. There's nothing between you and the space station except 230 miles of half atmosphere and half no atmosphere. But when you're shooting the signal across the earth, you actually have the curvature of the earth. You have hills, you have buildings, you have trees. You have a lot of stuff that gets between you and your signal, starts breaking that signal up as time goes by. So the signal's not going to travel very far to begin with. But what this guy was saying was, no, wattage is completely and totally irrelevant to the equation. What he was saying was, so long as your antenna is sufficiently high, you can talk to anyone basically anywhere at any distance, so long as your antenna is high enough. Yes and no. Because one thing he's leaving out, and one point he said was, well, I can get to a certain distance with a 50-watt radio, and I can get to the same distance with a 5-watt radio. Why would the extra wattage at increased distance mean anything? What he's completely missing is something called signal strength. And signal strength is is the ability to hold that repeater and actually push that signal into the repeater. You may be able to hit the repeater, you may be able to open the repeater, but you may not be able to hold the repeater because your signal is not strong enough. It simply does not have enough power. It may get there, but it ain't going to do much when it does. So let me give you a gun analogy, because I do a lot of gun analogies. One thing I used to do when I taught firearms was I would do long range shooting with pistols to show that a person at 100 yards, even 150 yards, could still be a threat with a handgun, not by virtue of skill, but by virtue of luck. They may, through sheer luck, get a round on you, and that round could cause you some serious damage. So I would do these long range shooting things. But at some point I would have to mention that at a certain point with a handgun round, it just runs out of gas. If it hits you, it's not going to have that much effect. So at extended distances, 200, 300 yards, a 9mm round is effectively useless. Whereas a rifle round, it's in its working zone at that distance. So that's sort of the difference between a 5-watt handheld and a mobile, is the difference between a pistol and a rifle. So in trying to go back and forth with this guy I was talking about earlier, I was saying, yeah, antenna height is one thing, but that extra wattage does things for you. If you do make that connection with the repeater at distance, the signal now possesses enough energy to actually open, hold the repeater, and pass the message traffic. This was completely eluding him. He said, nope, as long as the signal gets there, it doesn't matter. Wattage is completely unimportant. And I was puzzled by this. And you will run into this in Facebook groups where people are like, they're really stuck in their position and they will not listen to any input. They will not change their belief. It's called cognitive dissonance. That idea that does not arise from me is dismissed out of hand. Okie dokie. So I'm finally at some point, I'm getting ready to give up on this guy. And I'm pointing out, hey, look, all things being equal, if I have, and the experiment is easy to carry out. I go out to the mobile in my truck. Okay, I turn it down to low power, which is 5 watts. I try to open a repeater. I can kerchunk it, but I can't pass message traffic. Or with some repeaters, I don't even get to the repeater at all. I kick it up to 50 watts. I can open the repeater and talk on it. That tells me everything I need to know right there. Antenna height is important, but also wattage is important. And in some cases, when you can't get the antenna up high, wattage is going to get you through. This is where the mobiles come in. So I can still, I haven't raised my antenna any higher, but what I have done is increase the mass of the signal that's going out, and that can get you through certain situations as well, punching through dense undergrowth and bushes and trees and things. Also using UHF versus VHF because of the shorter wavelength that's able to wiggle through those obstacles and make it to the intended recipient. So I know there's a lot of information, but I'm hoping some of this sticks to your head at some point or gets a little around the ears. But that's the idea. Yes, you need to have, at some point, have a bigger, heavier tool to employ. If you're stuck with just a 5-watt HT, though, again, managing those expectations, knowing that if you can't increase the wattage, what you can do is displace or get higher. So in other words, what we're talking about here is if you're having difficulty getting through to a repeater, you need to maybe get away from the obstacles. Now let's relate it back to the other situation I had with people telling me, hey, we can't use your GMRS repeater, so none of us can open it. First question we ask is, okay, what are you using, where you're at, what's the equipment, what are the factors to be considered here? Here's what I hear back. I'm using my Baofeng, I'm in my house, I'm 38 miles away, and I can't open your repeater. Well, guess what? I can't either. I'm 37.5 miles away from the repeater, and I can't open it from inside my house with an HT, with a 5-watt HT. It's not going to happen. Just not. That's managing your expectations, is knowing that, hey, if the idea is to have as clear a sight as possible between this antenna and this antenna, or this antenna and the repeater's antenna, and you're trying to do it from within an obstacle, you're not going to get good results. You're just not. Go outside. Now, if I go outside, that same 5-watt HT, I can open the repeater and pass message traffic. It's got a little bit of hiss on it, a little bit of bacon sizzle, but I get through. But I got to go outside. But what these guys want is, well, we don't want to do that. We want to do it from inside our house. Okay. If what's that thing? If you can't bring this guy to the mountain, bring the mountain to this guy, or the horse to the water, or whatever. Why not just mount an external antenna on your house? If you insist on just using an HT only, then you're going to have to do something else. You're going to have to put an antenna outside, maybe up on the roof, maybe up a little high. And then that same 5-watt HT might just be able to get into the repeater. So these are challenges you need to look at. So if you're having trouble getting into a repeater, find a way to do that. And that may involve, because look, if you look at your house or your car is a good example. You're in a steel cage, it's got some windows. How's the signal getting out? The only way it's getting out is not going through the steel, it's going to go through the glass of the car. Even then that presents some problems, but not as many as you would think. But in a house, inside of a house, have you ever looked at a house being built and looked at the insulation and noticed that shiny metallic stuff they have on the back of the insulation? Yeah, that's called signal ain't getting through material. You've got a lot of barriers that your house represents that's going to prevent a signal from getting out. It's going to get out eventually through windows and things like that. But it's going to have a real difficult job getting out, and that signal that does get out is not going to be terribly strong at all. You may be able to kerchunk a repeater, but you ain't going to be able to hold it. So just know that, okay, my problem is I want to do my work from inside. I need to get outside. Then put an antenna on your roof. Put an antenna in your attic. There's a number of different solutions you can do. But if you're going to do that, then why not just put a base station in your house? And then you've got, from inside your home, you've got a 50-watt rig now with a much more capable antenna mounted on the outside of the house, and you can hit that repeater any day of the week. If you're outside, you don't have access to a mobile, you don't have access to a big antenna, you're not able to hit the repeater, examine where is the repeater at. And this is why you want to know from a map. You want to know from where I'm standing, where is the repeater actually? And you can notice maybe there's some buildings or a hill or something between you and that repeater. Displace so that you get a better view of that antenna, and you may find you get through at that point. But these are things that you have to now start adjusting and learning, and again, these are tactics, just like anything else. These are tactics for getting the job done and stuff that you need to know. So if you can increase wattage, that's a good thing. If you can increase your antenna, either the size of the antenna or the height of the antenna, that's a good thing. Displacing and getting a clearer line of sight to your antenna, that's a good thing. Getting closer to the repeater if possible is a good thing. In some cases, nothing you do with an HT is going to get through. Then you have to realize that that repeater's out of play. What else can I use? So that's when maybe we go to a mobile, and that's the only way we can hit that repeater, or we find a closer repeater that we're going to use on a regular basis. But I think all I really want to do is emphasize a couple of things with this whole presentation, and that is there's a lot you still have left to learn. These are useful devices, but do come with limitations. They're not going to be miracle devices. They're not an iPhone. We don't have 5G towers, every square mile that's going to reflect our signal. Sometimes it's difficult to make that contact, and it's not as easy as just turning the radio on and going. But secondarily, watch what information you're getting from your groups and your social media. The whole reason that I started this channel was to combat a lot of the disinformation that was out there in terms of radio reviews and information that people were getting. I'm by no means any expert, but I'm a reasonable person that has the ability to research and pass on pertinent information fairly accurately. Again, there's still a lot I don't know. I prove that pretty much every time I do a video. But there are some things that I do, I'm pretty damn certain of. And this argument that I got into this guy with, the one that I alluded to earlier, where saying wattage is just not important, antenna height is it. And I mean, he wouldn't budge on that for a second. Well, here's how this thing finally wound up. And in the end, I just stared at the monitor for about 10 minutes in amazement. I was looking at his follow-up to another question where a guy was saying, so you would not increase your wattage for any reason? And the guy said this. He said, well, if I ran my radio at high wattage, it would cause the signal that everyone receives from me, it would cause my sent signal to be so loud they would have to turn the radios down and then turn them back up when they start listening to other people. There's a couple of veteran radio guys out there that just went, what? Yeah, this guy actually, the whole reason he was so obsessed with keeping his wattage low is because he's under the impression that the output wattage affects the volume on the radio, and at the rates it would be super loud and then people would have to turn down. Wow. Okay, at that point it becomes obvious I'm dealing with somebody that actually doesn't know what they're frickin' talking about. They don't know much about radio. They know a little bit, but they don't know much. That's not a thing. That's just not a thing. Your output wattage on your signal has no effect whatsoever on the heard volume on the radio. Period. It doesn't happen. There are some things related to mic gain that can adjust the frequency of your message to make it uncomfortable to the ear. You can turn your mic gain up where you're real distorted, but it doesn't make your radio louder. It just doesn't. There's a whole lot of different things that are in play. All we're talking about is received signal strength. What the radio does with that received signal is controlled in terms of volume by this piece right here. It's not controlled by anyone else. If that was the case, radio would be almost completely ineffective and useless. Now, there are times when things like whether or not you're using wide or narrow band can have an effect on the volume being heard, but it's usually in terms of the volume being too low. There are a few other factors you can bring in. You can have your mic gain turned way down to where they're receiving a solid signal and the volume's too low. But what you don't get is the volume going super high because you're running at 100 watts. Because if you think about it, if you're using a repeater, the repeater's pumping out 100 watts. Just saying. Just saying. So, this has been kind of rambling, kind of ranging, kind of all over the place, but I'm hoping a little bit sticks in there that, look, HTs are good to go. You need one. You definitely need one. But they are not the only radio you need. There are other radios you need. There are other tools for the toolbox. That's it. So with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day. This is Scott, Kilo Sierra 6, Delta Alpha Yankee in Visalia, California. Next episode, we'll be actually talking about how to select a radio, and that'll follow actually pretty close because I'm going to film it right after I do this. So take it easy.